When we go back to the Old Testament, we are struck by this thing that was made that is called the Ark of the Covenant. All of us, I think, have heard of the Ark of the Covenant. There's a lot of drama surrounding the Ark of the Covenant. As all of us know, very popular movies have been made. And it seems like a magic box. And, you know, what would happen if somebody found it? And so the movie makers, as you well know, their imagination just runs wild. But it's not a bad thing to think about the Ark of the Covenant. Where is it? What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Now, we are embarking on a series as we examine the Ark of the Covenant. So you're not going to find out today where it is, but we'll get there. Stay with us. Now, this series will be broken up. Of course, we have the outdoor church, we have communion, other things that will break up the series. But we are going to go back to the Old Testament and then to the New Testament as well. And we are going to re-examine what the Bible has to say about the Ark of the Covenant. We need to ask ourselves, is an exploration of the Ark of the Covenant simply an act of going back and settling idle curiosity, or is an examination of the Ark of the Covenant relative to us today and important to us in our generation, in the day in which we live right now? If it's just an exercise of curiosity, it may not be that profitable. But I believe that the Ark of the Covenant has great value to us today, not just in our understanding, but actually in our salvation. So we're going to explore all of these things about the Ark of the Covenant. You may remember that the people of Israel came out of captivity in Egypt. Moses had delivered them with all the miracles, and now Moses came out with them and began to make this journey across the desert wilderness area up to the border of the Promised Land. Well, before they were to go into the Promised Land, God wanted to tell them about what kind of God He was. He wanted to deliver to them some of the attributes that He expected them to have in their lives if they were to be associated with Him. Now remember that back in that time, people had many gods. And so God now, Yahweh, was asking the people of Israel, will you be my special people? And will you be loyal to me and me alone? God revealed to them, I'm a jealous God, and it's just going to be you and me. And we're going to make a covenant together. And that covenant is your response, both by your words and your activities, of following the principles that I'm going to reveal to you that I want you to have in your life. So God brought them up to the place that we know as Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God began to thunder down, you remember, and He gave them the 10 Commandments. And then after that was done, God said to Moses, I want to come and be permanently with my people. You see, God had showed up on Mount Sinai, and you remember there was an earthquake and the people were terrified. And now Yahweh says, I don't want to have this as a one-time event. I want now to come down and I want to live with my people with whom I have made a covenant. God then instructed Moses, I need a house to live in. All the people had tents. God needed a tent if he was going to live with them. The Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites to take an offering for me. That is, to build my tent, my place. Tell them to take an offering for me from every person motivated by a willing heart. Notice now what God was proposing. God says, this great God that thundered down from Mount Sinai, God says, I want to live with you forever. I want you to be my people, and I will be your God. And we'll live here together. God asked then, will you, from a willing motivation based on that relationship, will you bring an offering to build my house? But notice now, it was not commanded. Every person had an opportunity to say, yes, I want to be part of building a place for Yahweh so that Yahweh will live here together with me. But it was a willing offering. What if God had thundered down and Moses had said, you must bring this amount of money in order? It would not have been a loving relationship. God was trying to form this union with his people so that their heart would be for him and he would always be with them and for them. And God says, if you want me to be there, then bring an offering. The people were given this instruction. We're not going to read all of this. This is the offering that you are to accept from them, God said. It was the things to build his house. You're to bring gold and silver, bronze, etc., etc. Then God said clearly, let them make me a sanctuary. But notice the reason for the sanctuary. There was a singular reason for the sanctuary. Sometimes we get so caught up in all the implements that were in the sanctuary and thinking about all of those and what those might mean that we forget the singular reason that God had them make a sanctuary. God said, let them make me a tent like theirs, but different, but I want a tent as well so that I can be with my people. And God said, let them make that so that I may live among them. Jesus wants to be with his people. The people had to be willing to have him there. And Jesus asked them by way of demonstration of that, would they please build his house for him? And so they did. The people willingly brought in everything so that the house could be built. You may remember at one time, Moses said, hey, it's too much. We can't handle this anymore. Keep it. But they were willing. And we often look at the negative history of the people of Israel. But here we see them opening their hearts so willingly so that Yahweh could come and live with them. Now, when we think of the Ark of the Covenant that was going to be placed in that sanctuary, what we understand from the Ark of the Covenant is that Ark of the Covenant was the place where Yahweh would live with his people. And so God had Moses build this box that is a couple feet deep and a couple feet tall, about 3.5 feet long. It was a beautiful thing. It was made out of wood, some sort of wood, not sure exactly what kind. I know what the Bible says, but we don't actually know exactly what kind of wood that was. But it was built out of some kind of wood. We assume a good wood that was going to last forever or a long time. And it was overlaid with gold. You know the story of that box. But what was really important about the box was that the 10 Commandments that God had thundered down from Mount Sinai, that basic code where God said, this is my covenant with you. I want you to love each other, and I want you to love me with all your heart. Do you see now this relationship that God was trying to form? Love me with all your heart and love each other. That's all God was asking of them. And that's why we know that Jesus, when he had that question about the law and the prophets and all of that, Jesus said, I want to tell you, on those 2 commandments, hang all the law and prophets. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. That was a covenant that God wanted with his people way back then. And initially, they seemed to want that covenant with Yahweh as well. And so they brought in all the gifts, and the house for Yahweh was built. Now, on top of that box, because God understood humanity, there is not a covenant that any one of us will ever make with God that we are not going to break. You don't believe me? I'm telling you, if you think you'll make a covenant with God and you want to in some way break it, you don't know your own heart. That's why the psalmist said the heart is deceivingly, he says, who can know their heart? Because it's deceivingly wicked above all things. God knew that, and so God said, look, I want you to take that covenant code of relationship between me and my people and between them and each other, and he says, I want you to put it inside of the box. And then God had Moses build the mercy seat. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, and 2.5 cubits shall be the length, and so forth. But a mercy seat of gold, you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark. And in the ark you shall put the testimony, that is the covenant code, that I will give you. There I will do what? I will meet with you. So God says to Moses, you now are the intermediary between me and my people. In the Old Testament, they needed an intermediary. In the New Testament, we don't need an intermediary. That's why the word priest and the concept of priest should have died when Jesus rose from the tomb. When Jesus came, the same Jesus that was asking the people of Israel to make his house for him with them, the same Jesus now, instead of thundering down from Mount Sinai in all of his glory, Jesus comes clothed in the humility of humanity. Those of you that were listening to Sabbath School this morning, remember that some brought that out. Laura, Reggie brought that out, that Jesus came as a not very significant appearing individual. His glory was masked. But back here, Jesus was going to live with the people over the Ark of the Covenant. And Moses would come in and communicate with him. And then he would go back out and we'd tell the people what God had told him. And we see several instances of this in the Old Testament. You may remember we looked at a passage a while back about that woman named Noah that had a gripe. And Moses went in to Yahweh and said, Yahweh, I don't know what to do about this. And Yahweh said to Moses, yeah, the girl's right. You need to change the system. Women should be able to inherit property. And so God changed it. So we see there in the Old Testament that sometimes these difficult things, Moses would go in there and he would talk to God. God would give him instructions. So what we see here is that there I will meet with you and I will tell you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim. We will come to cherubim on another week. Because normally, the idea is, cherubim, they put a couple angels up there. Well, we'll look at the issue of cherubim. But in any case, and I will tell you from above the mercy seat between the two cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, that I command you for the children of Israel. When Moses went into the tent of meeting to speak with Yahweh, he heard his voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was on the Ark of the Testament. So here we had this agreement that God was wanting to have with his people. That they would love him with all their heart, that they would love their neighbor as themselves. They were to now live that kind of life. And God put it in the box, had Moses put it in the box. And then on top of that box, God's throne was known as the mercy seat. God's throne, known as the mercy seat. You could not even get to the Ten Commandments to see how you were measuring up unless you first of all went through the everlasting, never failing mercy of God that had shrouded the Ten Commandments. I think sometimes we get this really wrong. We give people the Ten Commandments and tell them what they ought to be. And then we throw in Jesus down the road. And this is kind of the opposite lesson that we learn here. The Ten Commandments are extremely important. God had him put it in the box. But you could never evaluate your life by the Ten Commandments unless you first of all went through the mercy of God, because God knew his mercy must cover you. So there it was, the mercy seat. Now this ark would wander around a lot. And so we do see a lot of fantastic things happening with this ark. Thousands of people lost their lives because of it. Thousands of people enjoyed salvation and deliverance from their enemies because of it. So we find out that the ark would move around. It says when the ark went towards Moses said, "Rise up, Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered. Let those who hate you flee before you." So this ark, then, the throne of God, would be taken by the people of Israel, and they would go around from place to place. And the ark would go before them. And Moses says here, let all the enemies of Yahweh be scattered before him. So the Ark of the Covenant went with the people throughout the 40 years of the wilderness wandering. And then they came up to the border of the Promised Land. Joshua now took them across the Jordan River. You remember with the ark going first. Then the ark went over to Jericho and marched around the city for 7 days. You remember the story. But the people of Israel, as they went into the Promised Land, Yahweh went before them. Look, I don't care whatever we want to do in life, whether it's something specifically for the Lord or something for ourselves, if Yahweh doesn't go before us, you might as well stop and make sure He gets in front first. And so now we have the people with the ark going around, this covenant box going around in the various places. As Joshua got across the river, he said, look, the things that are there in the ark, the 10 Commandments, he said they need to be out here where everybody can see them. Remember, it was not a really illiterate society. Yes, there were some that could write, obviously some that could read. There was a rudimentary alphabet, etc. But how hard is it to remember the 10 Commandments? I mean, you don't need to hear it 20 times. You may not remember every word, but you know really what's there, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to remember that you don't need to steal from somebody else. I mean, those things are just, we understand that. By the way, without doubt, the law of God is written on the heart of every individual, and every individual knows when they are violating those principles. So, but Joshua said, look, I want this out in the open. And so he carved a big stone with the 10 Commandments on it. And he wrote on the stone the copy of Moses' law, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. So he did that in the promised land. He said, just in case any of you ever forget it, as you come by here and pass by, you can look and you can read them for yourselves. Now, the tent and the ark came to a place called Shiloh. It's north of Jerusalem, a number of miles north of Jerusalem. And there in Shiloh, they had the Ark of the Covenant, and they set up the tent. So when they came into the land of promise, this tent that had been moving around with them across the desert, now it got folded up, was brought over into the promised land, and was set up in this place called Shiloh. And at Shiloh, they set up the tent of meeting. I think you've seen these before. I've even shown these to you before. This is the archaeological site of Shiloh. You can see the big visitor center up there that you can go and look at the whole surrounding area. It is of a high elevation. I don't mean mountainous, but it is a good elevation. Doesn't really show in the picture. But this is a place where they built the ark. And if you go down off of that hill just a little bit, there is a flattened place like this, where this structure has been erected. This was the platform on which the people of Israel, probably thousands of them, can you see them out there with shovels and buckets leveling this place off? It's still there today, where they set up this place for God to live among them there at Shiloh. And so what you're looking at right now is the exact place where that sanctuary tent would have been set up, and where the Ark of the Covenant would have been located in Shiloh. Later on, it was moved to Bethel. And we know that because, we just pick up bits and pieces out of the Bible. But it says the people came to Bethel. And here's why: the Ark of the Covenant of God was there in those days. So it was in Shiloh first. Later, for some reason, we don't know, the Bible doesn't explain it, it was moved to Bethel. And then the Ark of the Covenant of God was there, and Eliezer stood before it in those days. So it seems like that it must have been a kind of at least, permanent location for the ark at Bethel. Now, Bethel is between Shiloh and Jerusalem. And Bethel, we're not going to go into all of Bethel today, but Bethel has a significant history in the Old Testament. But in any case, there is where the ark rested. So you can see this ark now was moving around place to place. It did not have a permanent home. It did not have a permanent structure. It just kept moving around. At some point, it came back up to Shiloh, because we find at the day of the first king now, in the time of Saul, the first king of Israel, that the people sent to Shiloh, and they brought from there the Ark of the Covenant. King Saul said, look, I have a war going on with the Philistines, and I want to have that box, because that box is the presence of Yahweh, and I think Yahweh can do some magic for me, and we'll get the Philistines defeated. He never consulted with Yahweh. He just brought the magic box and suffered a tremendous defeat. Tens of thousands of the Israelite people died. And the ark was taken by the Philistines. The Philistines had taken God's ark and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. And every place they put it, as you know the story, bad things started happening. And so they had it in one city and people said, "Whoa, get that out of here." And they moved it over to the next city and they said, "We don't want it." And then they moved it over and they kept moving around and nobody wanted it and they didn't know what to do with it. So finally they said, okay, well, in their pagan thinking, they said, if we will just give a lot of offerings and pile them up on a cart with this thing, maybe Yahweh won't be so angry with us any longer, and it will just find its way back over there and get out of the Philistine territory. And so they did that, and that's exactly what happened. And it ended up at Beth-Shemesh. And there at Beth-Shemesh, the people had it for just a little bit. The people of Beth-Shemesh were reaping the wheat harvest in the valley, and they lifted up their eyes, and they saw the ark, and they rejoiced to see it. But they didn't rejoice for too long, because some of them decided to take a peek, and many of them died. So then the people of Beth-Shemesh said, "We don't want this. Get this out of here." And so they said, okay, we wanted it to go up to Kiriath-Jearim. The men of Kiriath-Jearim came and took Yahweh's ark, and they brought it to Abinadab's house on the hill. Hills and worship back then were very important. That's a long story. But anyway, this man had a place on a hill, and so they thought, this is a good place. It's a high place, and so we'll put the ark here. And then they had someone that would stay there and take care of that. Now when we come down later into the time of King Saul brought the ark out again to be a magic box to help him defeat the Philistines. Once again, he didn't consult Yahweh. He just brought the magic box out. So we see Saul said, "Bring God's ark here," for it was with the children of Israel at that time, which is interesting because, of course, it had been the Philistines, but now they had it, and that's an indication of that, of course. It says, "Also, let us bring the ark of our God back to us again." So now what we've done is Saul ended, we know the end of the life of King Saul, and now King David comes to the throne. And King David gets together all the leaders of the people of Israel and brings them up for a big powwow. Now we know that King David loved Yahweh, didn't he? And so King David said to all the people, "Look, that box with Yahweh has not been with us. It's been wandering around all over the place." Notice what David said. He said, "We did not seek it in the days of Saul." So while it was there, no one was seeking Yahweh's purpose or Yahweh's will. Now this brings up something rather interesting that we're not going to solve today, but anyway, I'll share it with you. Moses could go in to seek Yahweh's guidance. And we find others later on in the Old Testament that were not the high priest that would go there and seek Yahweh's guidance, and Yahweh would speak to them. It's kind of a little bit of a mysterious transition. I know that many, when we go back and read the Old Testament, we say, well, only the high priest would go in there. The two sons of Aaron met their demise because they went in at the wrong time and did the wrong thing. But later on, we know that God was still communicating through this box. So what we know is that Yahweh was still there on the mercy seat. So it was not something, even though the box had been wandering around all over the place, Yahweh was still there. And so the people would consult with it. So David said, we did not seek it in the days of Saul. So what David is saying is, we need to ask Yahweh what to do. And we need that box back here so somebody can go in there and talk with Yahweh. They set God's ark on a new cart and brought it out of Abinadab's house, and it was that was on the hill. And Uzzah and they drove the cart. So you know the story. They went up, David and all the people. They went up to get the ark. They all agreed with David. Yes, we need to bring this back. So they brought the ark back down, and on the way, you know the story of Uzzah, and he reached out to stabilize the ark. We're not going to look at the story of Uzzah today, but Uzzah died as a result of it. The Bible says that David was angry now with Yahweh. And it also says that he was scared to death of Yahweh. And this magic box now became something that David was hoping would be good for them. Now David was petrified of it. And David said, oh, you take that someplace else. We don't want that in Jerusalem. And so they took it over to this other guy's house, Obed-Edom, who wasn't so afraid of it like David for some reason. And so there they parked it for a few months. And then you know that finally David began to think about this. He says, nope, we need to bring it to Jerusalem. So he went and he made a tent. It wasn't the original tabernacle tent. It was something different that David had done. So David set up a tent in the city of David. Now, the city of David is lower than the Temple Mount. The old city of David is down below. By the way, they're doing a lot of excavation there today. I don't mean this day, but right now, they're doing excavation of that. They've uncovered a lot of it. But in any case, David brought it there. And there it was in that tent. So Yahweh remained in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all of his house. And that's when David said, yeah, we need to bring that back down to Jerusalem. So they brought in Yahweh's ark and set it in the place in the middle of the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before it. And there it was until Solomon said it should not be there any longer. So Solomon made all of these vessels in abundance. Now this is really interesting. The old sanctuary of Moses and all the utensils that went with it, somewhere along the line had been lost or destroyed. Table of showbread, the candlestick, all of those things had been lost or destroyed. The only thing that remained was the ark. And so now Solomon remakes everything. Thus Solomon made all these vessels in abundance, for the weight of brass could not be determined. Solomon made all the vessels, and all of this gets listed. You see the table of showbread, the lampstands, etc., etc. So Solomon now redid all of this. So we understand, now when we look back at the Old Testament, we're not finished with the Old Testament. We'll come back to more at another part of the series. But what we do understand is that this box not only represented the presence of God with his people, it was actually the presence of God with his people. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to limit God in time and space, okay? But in the way the Bible reveals this, that was actually Yahweh that was riding around on top of this box all over the place. Until now, a more permanent home was made for Yahweh to be with his people in the temple that Solomon finally built. We'll pick up on some of these things in the next part of the series. But I think our attention, when we look at something this significant in the Bible, that's had such a tremendous impact on the whole history of God's people, it seems like to me we better pay attention.